Yeah, thank you. Really interesting set of presentations, and I think George started off with the history of some of the environmental concerns and how we've gradually made progress in the last 5 decades or so, with actually measuring and modeling some of these processes. And I think it is interesting that George finds it hard not to make it autobiographical, because he has influenced so much of this literature and so many of the people working in this area. I think that's very much to his credit and to his wisdom in terms of the work that he's done in this area. I guess one thing that comes to mind when I think about history as well is Malthus and the impact that Malthus had both on the economics profession and on ecology, with the idea of carrying capacity and the basic dynamics of population. And I think it's also interesting if you actually go back and read Malthus on the role of human knowledge, the role of education in dealing with some of these dealing with the population problem or with other types of limits to human potential into the ecosystem. And it is interesting. Malthus, I think, is often interpreted as very pessimistic. But if you go in to read his third edition of his book, his essay on population, it is interesting that Malthus was quite optimistic about how knowledge can give us the ability, human knowledge, human education, can give us the ability to manage some of these impacts and perhaps bring about a more bountiful future rather than leading us into continual decay. So I think that's an important element of economic history as well. I guess I'll skip to Eric's analysis, and I think that's a nice way to kind of wrap up these several sessions where we've been talking about modeling ecological systems. And I think his work gets into the details of actually modeling these systems and shows us some of the difficulties, and particularly with precision. We can't know things to the level that we might like with respect to our disciplinary area and build it in and link it into the concepts and models of other disciplines. So, Eric, I guess I have a question in terms of, what kind of testing do we need to do? And I don't mean to, I want to ask one other question before you answer, but I do think that's an important question for these types of models. Is how do we evaluate them? How do we improve them over time? What kind of testing, so what kind of ground checking needs to be done to make sure that they're, modeling the human interactions that we're interested in, rather than just being interesting models? Because certainly there's that potential that they kind of float off and become computer models, as opposed to really modeling the human interactions with the environment. The other element that comes in too, Eric, that you mentioned is, and Amy and Jua mentioned, is the idea of a production function. And I'd like to have a little bit more discussion of production functions and what you've done with ecologists specifically to try and estimate ecological or natural capital production functions. So I think I'll leave it there with my comments. I'm sure we've got a lot of comments from the audience.
Let's let them take a stab at some answers and then get your questions ready.
Well, we struggle with model validity on the technical sense. Are these models, especially if we make them simpler tier 1 models, are they actually expressing the real world processes? In terms of, I think the question you asked was, how do we know that these are kind of the values that people are responding to? I guess we haven't really thought about that at all, in the sense that we're interested in modeling the values that at least policymakers will respond to. So if they know that there's a market for red for reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, how much could they expect to make in the market? One of the services that I didn't talk about was recreation and tourism, and we actually do use some travel cost methods there, and then also use the explanatory variable is visits to a site, and how do we explain those visits to a site. So that is one of the ways that we're trying to tie it back. And the other thing I didn't, I kind of glibly passed over it was the aesthetic and cultural values. And for a lot of people in this project, it's not a glib part of the project. So Gretchen Daly is very involved in Hawaii and looking at how the native people in Hawaii respond to the landscape, and how the Kamehameha schools in Hawaii, which was the group that was founded by the last queen of Hawaii as she abdicated her throne to the Americans, that they were given a lot of land, and how now they're interested in restoring that land back to its native, what it looked like, when the white people first showed up, and then trying to actually fish in a culturally sensitive way. So, so that's my answer to that.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to mention about production functions. I quickly mentioned about the work that we're doing on valuing benefits, ecological benefits from reduced air pollution, reduced acidification in southern Appalachian mountain region. And the production function there that we're interested in has to do with how changes in air pollution then translate into changes in these ecosystems that people might care about. And so the way we've approached this was collaborate with ecologists who actually are modeling air pollution effects in different kinds of ecosystems. And for instance, in aquatic ecosystems, we focused on changes in the acid neutralizing capacity of mountain streams, and how those changes would be linked to actual changes in air pollution that were modeled based on actual policy changes, Title IV change that basically reduces acidification in a certain way in the next 20 years. So we modeled that impact for a large number of streams, and it was calibrated to actual conditions. And then we had a linkage between the A and C, acid neutralizing capacity, and the number of species in these different streams and their abundance. And then we were able to use that as a link to actually communicate to people how changes in air pollution would then link to the kinds of changes that they might be interested in. And so that was quite extensive, but it was doable in our case.
But that's not really a production function, at least in the sense that I was thinking. So to give a similarly complicated example, I'm proposing to do some research with a hydrologist and 3 computer scientists of the hydrology of Chicago, combining a model of the underground tunnel system, a model of the sewer system, and a model of the ground level sewer shed, and land use, land cover, and it will take 5 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and we can't do that everywhere. So, one of the things that I want to do in that project is to try to extract a production function, and to use the work that we do there to try to see if there's anything general we can say. If you put rain barrels this close to this kind of sewer, what does that accomplish in terms of reducing flood frequency? I don't know if it's possible, but so much of what gets done is really complicated, multi-personnel, multi-year, very geographically narrow studies, that it doesn't lend itself to application of any kind of widespread usefulness at all. And so we as scholars need to, I think, buckle down and sacrifice precision in order to produce something a little bit sort of generalizable that can be put into models like the natural capital project's using.
Questions from the floor? Okay. Well, we'll let you have the first, and then.
So I like the maps and the question for the INVEST tool on the natural capital project. So are we getting closer to coming up with sort of a supply map for ecosystem services and maybe a demand map for ecosystem services, so you could see where the best return on investment would be for nutrient farming, for example?
Yeah, I mean, there are some really good supply maps of different water services, right? So the challenges are if we could impose a demand, right? We could basically say we want to cap the amount of nutrients that are flowing into the river. So where's the greatest bang for our buck? Where should we pay farmers to stop using nutrients because they either have the value of farming on that land is relatively cheap and the flow from that point into the river is relatively high, so you get these kind of you get this really advantageous trade-off. So those are generally available. The problem then is that if one person makes a change, how does that affect the behavior of everybody else in the landscape? And so just because it looks like on a supply map right now that if this farmer, and this farmer stopped using nutrients, then we would have a much better system. But if this farmer and this farmer and this farmer stopped using nutrients, maybe there's price effects that would cause other people in the watershed who were not using as many nutrients to increase them, and suddenly it's these kind of secondary effects, this feedback, that it's unintended consequences. We actually have worse. So the problem with these supply maps is they're static. They're for the current condition. And what happens when people, because when one person makes a change, usually other people make a change.
Thank you. This is probably for Amy and Eric, but everybody. In terms of valuation, when you look at current value or net present value versus some future value as you're doing an assessment of the economic or the econometrics of whatever you're looking at, how do you take into account the variation? If you're looking at fixed assets, I can tell you what the future value is and I can discount it and you can do all your regressions or whatever. But the future value of something that we don't know about, the unknown future value of a forest with use that becomes Taxol for a cancer treatment drug, how do you at least accommodate that in your model? What kind of envelope might you put around that? Because a U before Taxol was just another bush in the forest. All right.
That's like one of the hardest questions in economics, right? Good job. I think the kinds of projects that we're talking about, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but it's often kind of short term. So we're looking at people's willingness to pay today for things for flows that are going on today. Although in the invasive species project, we're talking about invasive shrubs that take a long time to invade, and so we're going to have to worry about long-term processes. It's a lot like studying climate change, where costs and benefits accrue very far in the future with a great deal of uncertainty. Economists as a discipline have been working on this, but it is one of the most difficult things to wrestle with. What kind of discount rate do you apply? And how do you take into account unlikely outcomes that are nevertheless either very, very bad or very, very good? We're still wrestling with it. We avoid those problems when we can, but really because it's hard for everybody. It's hard for us as a profession. It sort of stretches the envelope of what we can do well and comfortably without arguing. We haven't argued much yet, Dick, but I think if we were doing that, we would argue. Yeah.
The way that we're trying to address this in the Natural Capital Project is that every time we give an estimate, we want to give a lower and higher bound, right? So here's a classic case for carbon. Carbon sequestration, a unit of carbon sequestration supposedly will reduce economic damage in the future. How much will it reduce? It depends on what interest rates are used, what discount rates were used, what equity weights were used. So in our example, we would probably apply a social cost of carbon of $30 as estimated by Nordhaus and $350 as estimated by Stern, and say that that's the outer envelope. So if you evaluate projects with Nordhaus, a lot of carbon sequestration projects are not that valuable. Few and valued with Stern, I think we should all basically plant trees in our backyard.
Okay. Way back.
Yeah, actually, can I add something to the valuation? I think a lot of the everyday valuation of market goods takes place under some kind of uncertainty. For instance, if we think about prices that landowners pay for arable land or forests, reflect lots of uncertainties. And those kinds of uncertainties, if we use, for instance, land values as a measure of value, then some of those uncertainties might already be accounted for.
Can I just make one comment too?
Okay.
There was a proposal recently, I think it's the journal Frontiers of Ecology, is that right? I don't know, it's an electronic journal, anyone familiar with that? But it had a very interesting proposal for using a futures, options market type of framework for dealing with that sort of problem. I think they were aiming it at endangered species and the restoration of environments for endangered species. But basically the idea was to set up a type of market for options to take into account both the different guesses about what the probability of that event actually happening, like in your case it would be the event finding a new medication as a result of some species. In their case it was the species actually surviving, as getting out of endangerment. And so that was one of the proposals for how you incorporate people's best guesses and offer an economic incentive for people to act on those best guesses in preserving the resource.
Okay. We have a question back in the middle there. Yes.
Hi, thanks for your talk. In looking at the costs and benefits and then the market values of ecosystem services, everyone's been talking one by one, carbon, water, and so on and so forth, but everyone's acknowledged the inherently interdependent nature of all of those services. And one of the bigger discussions in policy right now in looking at creating regulatory markets is the stacking versus bundling of credits, and or that they should all be valued in a suite or sold off one by one. So I was wondering, what is your opinion, each of you, your opinion on that decision, and then how would that impact both the market value of a given plot of land and its ecosystem services?
That's a broad general question. Go for it. Either of you.
Ladies first, great, I love it. I guess certainly they're interdependent. The main thing that worries me about the way that markets are going with multiple services is that right now all we really have is carbon. And so I think just getting markets for all of them, or at least many of the ecosystem services, would already be a big improvement. I can't think of any reason why you would need to bundle them. If things go together, they'll go together. They'll be traded together. There's no reason they couldn't be. And the extent to which they're bundled and the way in which they're bundled varies on the landscape. And so I can't see why there would be an advantage to bundling them in any fixed ratios. Anybody else?
One of the last maps I didn't show was that, we are very interested in bundling services. So we were saying, if you can convert everything into a dollar metric, then it's very easy to bundle services. Not necessarily for a payment for ecosystem service scheme, but just for policymakers to know that this portion of the landscape tends to produce a lot of different services, and that if you make a land use change on this portion of the landscape, you're going to lose a lot of value in water services, carbon, biodiversity. I think most schemes that are payment for ecosystem services probably work best if you focus on one service, because otherwise it gets a little hairy and complicated. Obviously, though, you're right. There was a paper that came out a couple years ago in Science that showed if we significantly increase the carbon sequestration potential on the Midwestern landscape, will really change the microclimates when it comes to precipitation and to water use. And so by increasing that service, we actually can have negative effect on another service. So that is where evaluating the trade-offs between services via land use change is important. And making sure that when you set up a payment for ecosystem service scheme, that while you increase one service, you're not somehow detrimentally affecting another service.
Although, if I can just follow up, that is the problem with focusing on just one service with a payment for ecosystem services system. That
I'm going to take one more quick question, and the answers also have to be quick. And yes, you're on.
Hi, I'm working on a project for the Wilderness Society in California evaluating large-scale solar developments in the California desert. One thing I'm curious about is how you think new technologies for renewable energy might be changing how we look at ecosystem service values. One thing that struck me was the Costanza map and looking at the desert landscapes having no color to them, meaning no value. And I don't think that that would be the case if you asked someone what they thought about the desert ecosystem. Can you speak a little bit about what you think the future might look like in terms of how renewables and renewable technology will change the way we value ecosystems?
Great point. I think that's really true. You know, we have the advancement of technology, and that does change the value of resources. At one time, you know, petroleum was a throwaway product, or gasoline was a throwaway product. People wanted the kerosene. And I think you're quite right. As technology advances, and we find ways to use these ecosystem functions in a better way, in a less damaging way, such as solar power, that map will change dramatically. That's a very good point.
Except here's a case where the solar power is in conflict with the values of the desert and how to maintain the values of the desert.
So that will come into play too.
Yeah, as technologies emerge, they alert us to new problems and to new things that we need to value or will begin to value. And so it is a constantly changing system.
I think this is an example. The first place you need to put ranges for that. Also, I think we have to recognize that much of what we're saying today will turn out to be not so correct tomorrow. But that doesn't, what's the alternative? We've got to do the best we can. Otherwise, we're just acting at random, and that's worse.
I guess I would suggest that an alternative is to dial back and not let the drivers keep speeding up. And of course, that's what we're all trying to do by thinking about ecosystem services and their value. But we could just say, let's consume less, let's have fewer hydrocarbons being burned. Let's, while we're trying to optimize with drivers pushing the system to the brink, we really need to just turn back the drivers and then optimize rather than the other way around. And so that will be my parting message, but the panel doesn't have to agree. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I thought that was a fantastic discussion and excellent questions. It's always nice to see economists being challenged from the audience. So thank you very much, everyone. So you can see we have a lot to talk about, so we're running a little behind. So let's just take a 5-minute break, and then we'll move on from modeling to implementation.